First of all,
now, let me begin with the first slide. And the first slide, as always, this is a marketing slide, and please forgive me. Just 1 second, there we go. And I will allow for a second or two to pass before I start speaking, just to factor in any latency with connections. Now, as I started to say, and then I was sidetracked, this is a slide that's often required by marketing teams to explain who you are. I do apologize for the black and white picture and the extreme close-up, but my background is in the financial services sector. For many years, I worked at two of the largest banks in Europe and around the world, the Royal Bank of Scotland and the Lloyds Banking Group. And my experience in cybersecurity, in fact, dates back to 2005, when the bank that I was working for at the time, which was called the HBOS Group, suffered its very first phishing attack. So I have seen all of the evolutions in the different attack vectors. So back in 2005, the most sophisticated problem that I had to deal with was phishing attacks, and that very quickly morphed into fast flux phishing attacks, circumventing two-factor authentication. So a daily battle with cyber criminals as we introduced new mitigating controls and how they work to circumvent them. If anybody had told me in 2005 that one of the most challenging problems that I would be looking at in 2020 would have been state-sponsored attacks, I probably wouldn't have believed you. And for those of you that are so inclined and have some minutes, you do please feel free to Google me. A lot of white papers and thought leadership papers are available on the internet. And again, it just helps to fill out some of my background and my experience and expertise. Now, this is just a scene setter. Again, I want to give you a sense of who the organization is, and I want to draw your attention to the logo at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. My presentation style is I don't intend to read through the bullets on the screen. I'm going to pick on certain particular features that I think are important, so I hope you're comfortable with that. So the GCHQ logo that you can see, I just want to make something very clear. We are not a part of that organization. Nobody in that organization has access to our technology, and vice versa. It's simply that we met GCHQ, they took a look at the technology and they said, well, we're in the field of deception. We regard ourselves as experts, so we quite like your technology, and we'll make you part of the accelerator program. And all that simply does is it allows us to use the logo, and from time to time, GCHQ may invite us to closed sessions that they're holding where they're talking with industry leaders from friendly nation states. The organization itself is based, Countergraft itself is based both out of UK and Spain, and there's no offshoring or any kind of development done in any other country other than the two countries that you can see up there on the slides. Now, for those of you who are interested in what is the look and feel of the types of customers that we're working with, well, this ranges all the way from global retail organizations, transportation, financial services, etc., etc. So it goes across the full spectrum of different industry verticals that currently are out there. Okay, now for those of you that already know what cyber deception is, please accept my apologies. I'm doing a basic 101 on deception. What is deception? And for those of you that are not familiar with cyber deception, this is a good scene setter. Now, cyber deception isn't a new tactic. I mean, people often, when they're talking about cyber deception, quote the Trojan Wars, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with. But I tend to use this example because I think it better illustrates what deception brings when it comes to dealing with threats. Now, the Battle of El Alamein is significant because, as you can see on the right, German forces had technically superior tanks. They were in a superior tactical position and outgunned, and were capable of outgunning and outmaneuvering the forces of the Allies, which were the leader of those forces in this particular battle was Montgomery. Now, the objective here was how could you outmaneuver the Germans with a tactically inferior force? So the deception here was built on deploying actual fake tanks, or actually blowing up tanks using, they were built out of balloon-like materials. You were able to just put air into the balloon and it would inflate and it would look like a tank, an inflatable tank. They used camouflage. They also used false radio signals. So there was a sustained campaign where information was passed, which suggested through the use of radio signals that the particular force that had been gathered at El Alamein was far greater and far more sophisticated than it was. Now, this brings a very important point to light, which is that deception has to be multifaceted if that deception is going to be successful, and hence the reason why deception is more than simple honeypots. The example of a simple honeypot would have been just to blow up an inflatable tank and, for example, convince the Germans that there was far more tanks in the Allied forces than was actually the case. But with the use of sophisticated radio signals, with the use of sophisticated camouflage, and in addition the inflatable tanks, the deception becomes multifaceted because you have to convince your adversary that they're dealing with the real thing. Now, what do we mean by deception when we come to the field of networks? Now, what we're looking at here is building up synthetic environments that look and feel as if they are part of your infrastructure. Why would you want to do that? The objective here is that we want the attackers to disclose their motives, their tools, and their tactics. This is critical, and this is going to become apparent when I move through the presentation, because collectively that's referred to as TTPs. Focusing on getting an attacker to disclose their TTPs is very, very important when it comes to your defense in depth strategy and what is commonly referred to as the pyramid of pain. If you haven't heard about that, not to worry, I'm going to cover it in some detail. But for the time being, if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from this slide, apart from the basics of deception, is to remember the word TTPs, tools, disclosing motives. That's the key that we want to achieve with deception. Right, let's cover some basic concepts. Now, traditionally, when people talk about deception, they tend to think of deception being deployed inside your corporate environment. But it's very, very important to note that certainly the countercraft solution has the ability to deploy deception campaigns both internally and externally. And what do I mean by externally? As you can see on this slide here, I'll just try and hover my mouse over it here. You can see there that we're capable of deploying deception campaigns on the internet. Okay, so we can stand up infrastructure in the cloud, or we can stand up infrastructure that's hosted entirely on the internet itself. That's very, very important to remember. We're not limited simply to the corporate network. Okay, now the deception environment itself can be, as I've covered here, can be stood up in the on-prem or in the cloud, and breadcrumbs that attract the attackers can also be deployed either inside your network or externally. So give me some examples, Naheem. So what I mean here is that a breadcrumb, instead of it being deployed on an endpoint somewhere inside your network or on a server, you can take a breadcrumb and deploy it in Pastebin, in GitHub, in Shodan. If you want to do, you could deploy breadcrumbs on the dark web. Certainly working with Countercraft, you could. So what I want to emphasize here is, please, I want you to think about deception technology being capable of being deployed externally and internally, and certainly I can only speak as far as the Countercraft solution is concerned that we can run what we call deception campaigns concurrently, i.e. at the same time, both inside your network and outside your network, i.e. on the internet. So if I just talk you very quickly through moving from right to left on the screen here, what you can see breadcrumbs, which are the small, I'll just move my mouse over here, and sorry, I'll slightly be looking off camera as I'm looking at a different screen for the actual slide deck itself. The breadcrumbs here are, remember, can either be deployed on your endpoints, or we can deploy them in some form of data repository or forum on the internet, or any other piece of infrastructure on the internet. Okay. Once an attacker engages with those breadcrumbs, they are then led into the deception environment. And once again, folks, please remember, it can be internally or externally. And then we get them to reveal. Now, remember what I asked you in the previous slide? TTPs. Why do those TTPs matter? They matter because they're relevant to the pyramid of pain, and that plays directly into your defense in depth strategy. So we're going to come back and we're going to connect all of the dots regarding that later on. Okay, so Naheem, what do breadcrumbs look like? These breadcrumbs that I've been talking about can either be, as you can see on the screen, they can either be passive or active. I want to deal with that differentiator first. An active breadcrumb, once it is actually touched, it beacons immediately. So there isn't necessarily a redirect to a deception asset. Just by the very fact that it's been touched, there's an alert sent out, and we collect some basic telemetry from the actor that has touched that particular breadcrumb. And then you have the passive breadcrumbs that you can see on the slide there, and these lead the attackers into the deception environment. A question that I'm often asked is, Naheem, how can you guarantee that the threat actor is going to engage with the breadcrumb? And I say that I can't guarantee, but what I can say is that it is highly probable. And the reason why it's highly probable is because the breadcrumbs are crafted in a manner that appeals to the threat actor. And why do they appeal to the threat actor? Because they feed into a psychological need of the attacker. So rather than trying to focus on technological needs, we're focused on psychological needs, because psychological behaviors are far difficult to change. So they have a need to move laterally. They have a need to look for credentials to hack into a server or to move from one point or another. Presented with a breadcrumb that is appealing to your need to either collect information on an organization you're looking to attack, or to break into their infrastructure, it's very, very difficult to resist. And also, please remember, the attacker has no reason to believe that that breadcrumb is not a legitimate breadcrumb. They're not thinking about deception, certainly not in 2020. Now, this slide, for those of you that may not be familiar with this UK-based company, it's called EasyJet. Data breaches, and I know people think, oh God, he's going to start talking about data breaches again. But the issue is we don't appear to be learning, because data breaches continue to take place. And this is the latest one from a couple of weeks ago. And it's not the first one in the UK airline industry. Last year, we had British Airways. Question I have for my audience today is, at what point do we start to do things differently? Because clearly our current approach is not working, because the attackers continuously and consistently get through. Are we going to change how we look at this problem, or are we simply going to continue to repeat our mistakes? Currently, what we're asking our SOC teams and our security personnel to do, we're asking them to be right every time. Every time an attacker attempts to get into the network, they can identify it and stop it. The security team has to be right 100% of the time. The odds are stacked in the favor of the attackers. What if we were to change that paradigm? We were to ask the attackers to be right every single time. How? Distribute deceptive breadcrumbs that actually deflect the attacker out of your network and into a deception environment. If these breadcrumbs are distributed deliberately right across all of your endpoints, and even better, let's say that even before they get anywhere near your network, we deploy them in a pre-breach phase, the odds suddenly are in our favor. Now, the cost of data breaches, now you can look at GDPR fines and there's lots of different variables. The thing that I think that's really fascinating from a personal perspective, and I'm calling this out, is that that's a big number up there on the screen with respect to Equifax. But certainly if I was in the leadership team, and part of that leadership team of Equifax, what I would be more concerned about is the fact that Moody's slashed the rating outlook for Equifax for the very first time based on their cybersecurity problems. So sometimes people can be quite cynical and say that these losses can be absorbed. They'll be covered by my cyber insurance. And an interesting footnote to that Equifax data breach is that cyber insurance didn't cover that huge figure. So you really, as a board, as an institution, as a security organization, you're now looking at consequences of actions that actually impact the outlook for the rating of the stock. Now, I'm not talking any longer just simply about the share price. I'm not going to dwell on this slide too long. I just want to point one very quick thing out. People were very cynical when GDPR came out, and they said, well, we're going to wait and see. The huge fines are not going to be levied, and we really can't. We're going to challenge this legally. Well, the data's there. It's up there on the screen. I think it paints an undeniably simple narrative. There will be severe financial consequences under GDPR for data breaches. The question is, what kind of position do you want to be in if, when it comes to data breaches, you're able to detect and deflect potential attackers against your network? Now, some of you who are in leadership roles, potentially even heads of SOCs, some of these key metrics here are really relevant. Now, one that I really want to focus in on, those will resonate with you, I'm sure, cyber resilience. So the question that I have is that in a post-COVID-19 economy, cyber resilience is mission critical. How many organizations can afford for their online presence to be compromised because someone's hacked into the network or has hacked onto one of your online servers in a economy where perhaps your only means of communication potentially could be through your online channel with your suppliers, with your customers? The question to be, as we move out of the current lockdown, pandemics may well become the norm, and this may well come back again in the winter, and we may be forced into another lockdown scenario where customers, suppliers, and anybody else that you do business with simply cannot get into a bricks and mortar building to communicate with you. Now, I'm not picking on these technologies, and I think it's very important that you understand that. All I'm simply highlighting is that there is no silver bullet. These solutions offer you some degree of protection, but they also present you with some very severe challenges. You can see those on the screen, and I don't intend to delve into them in any detail here. But you got network traffic analysis, user behavior analytics, SIEM and EDR. I mean, the pain points certainly with respect to SIEM and network traffic analysis in terms of the amounts of data that they produce, that is really well known. Sometimes, and again, I'm not looking to pick on EDR, but sometimes I'm having conversation with security leaders and they say, but Naheem, I'll be fine, I've got EDR, why do I need deception? Well, we come back to the old concept of defense in depth, and we look at EDR evasion. There's three primary techniques, misdirection, minimization, and memory invasion. This is not going to be a class on how to evade EDR. But misdirection, for example, fits into process hallowing, where you can inject a malicious process into a legitimate process, and it effectively can bypass EDR. Now, a very famous example of that was Duku. And Duku is an example of where that misdirection technique was used to avoid EDR. So there is a really good case history if you're prepared to search for it. It does suggest that you cannot place all of your security budget, or certainly all of your hopes that EDR is going to detect all of the attackers. And when you look at some of these big breaches like British Airways, EasyJet, etc., you assume that as a very minimum they were going to have at least have had some EDR deployment in place. So how do we sum this up? I just want to look at this in this format. So when I'm looking at CM technology, EDR technology, NTA, UBA, there's just one common characteristic that links all of those technologies. And what they're focusing in on is big data. Let's collect as much information as possible, analyze it to the best of our ability, and then from that try and connect the dots. You know, and those odds are in the favor of the attacker, because the attacker can hide within the big data and sit back and wait for those types of technologies to connect the dots and to find them. But how about we take a different approach, which is the approach that deception takes, which is let's focus on the right data. Let's actually distribute breadcrumbs. We're not using big data. Draw the attackers to us rather than the other way around. And once they engage with the breadcrumb, we get them to reveal the big data about them. What's the big data that they have? Their TTPs, their tools, and their motives. Now, here are some characteristics of right data. Now, the one that I would specifically pick on, which is really critical, is that data needs to be delivered in real time. Okay, so you can ask yourself, you know, when you're having to analyze information against a big data pool, is that in real time? Whereas if an attacker touches a breadcrumb, that's real time. They deflect it into a deception environment where we start in an automated fashion manipulating the adversary to get them to reveal all of their big data about them, so that you then have big data with all of the dots, connected, right? And then you can use that big data to hunt for that attacker elsewhere in your network. I want to focus on 6 key characteristics that I believe certainly the technology that I work with delivers, the deception technology that I work with delivers. Real-time threat intelligence. So what I mean by real-time threat intelligence, if you have a threat intel vendor, there is going to be a lag between collection, aggregation, and delivery, and then it actually gets to you so that you can use it. But if you look at deception, because we're collecting intelligence on the attacker as the attacker is engaging in that behavior, the delivery of the intelligence is actually just a second or two old, and it's delivered to you immediately. Real-time, actionable intelligence that is relevant to you as an organization. Again, that's not big data, that's the right data at the right time, in the right place, in front of the right people to take action. What do I mean by advanced threat detection? What I mean by advanced threat detection is simply that we're changing the odds in our favor. Rather than the SOC team and security organization having to be right all the time, we are forcing the attackers to be right all the time, and therefore our method of detection has evolved and is advanced. Threat correlation and threat mapping, and certainly I'm only talking to the countergraph technology in this instance, which is that we have the ability to take that behavior, map it to the MITRE framework in real time, point number 1, and point number 2, we can correlate that with an external threat actor database that we have, and that behavior has also been mapped to the MITRE framework. The question is, so what, Naeem? The so what is that it enables you to hunt for threat actors that are elsewhere inside your network, and secondly, it will empower your teams to actually contextualize and understand the threat far more quickly than you would be able to do without those mappings and correlations. Now, this is my personal favorite, strategic drivers. So the question to ask yourself is that the intelligence that you're receiving, does it actually shed any light on the strategic driver of the threat actor? And what I mean here, I give a very simple example here, is the German car manufacturer. They start off with the assumption that if an attacker was to break into the network, they would steal the car blueprints. A reasonable assumption to make. However, it's an assumption. When the attacker breaks in, their strategic objective were the blueprints to the power plant. So that's why understanding the strategic drivers is absolutely critical. It enables you to understand where should I be deploying my security resources. Secondly, the strategic drivers will help you contextualize as to what type of attacker am I up against, because an attacker that's trying to steal the blueprints to your manufacturing plant is probably, the inference you can draw from that is probably a state-sponsored attacker, and that piece of information feeds into, well, what should our incident response process look like? At what point do we bring in external agencies to assist us? The modeling of behavior is understanding exactly how an adversary behaves. What are the first 10 pieces of behavior that they demonstrate on an asset that they've compromised? That's absolutely critical because again, it's right data, not big data, and it empowers you to then hunt for the attacker to understand, have they breached any other asset inside my network? And if you have subsidiaries, enables you to send real-time intelligence to those subsidiaries and for those local SOC operators to understand, is that threat actor in any other part of the network, in any other geographical location. And real-time adversary manipulation is that if you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to actually extract further information on the threat actor, you can actually manipulate them in real time. So for example, all of this is automated. You could, for example, tell the platform, if the adversary runs Mimikatz, offer them up credentials. So we're actually manipulating, and the reason why we want to do that is we want to get a better understanding of what that threat actor is actually up to on that particular asset. What does this look and feel like? Here's a quick screenshot. Now, again, you might say, well, Naheem, looks very similar to the stuff that you could get on an EDR solution, but here's the difference. The EDR is big data, we are right data. You're only going to be looking at this information if it's actually triggered by a threat actor. You've got a high fidelity piece of information, which is 100% not a false positive. You know it's a threat actor actually engaging with a deception environment and downloading a file via HTTP command and utilizing PowerShell. That's happened in the last second. That's the difference. Concrete intelligence delivered in real time that helps you to understand the behavior of the threat actor. You're not wondering what if, maybe, is that good or bad? Do I need to create a rule? Do I need to get someone else to take a look at this? And at the bottom of the screen there, you can see the reference to T1086. That's the MITRE framework built into the solution. Okay, you can see here, I've highlighted in red, you have the ability to apply your own playbooks so that the analyst again understands exactly what they need to do. So that feature is available. And then you can see the second circle in red there is the reference to Mimikatz running. And again, as I pointed out earlier, you have the ability to manipulate the adversary so that when they do see Mimikatz running, you can offer them up a credential and lead them further into the deception environment. Just a couple of quick slides on what the look and feel of the MITRE mapping is. We've got one here. So this is for the deception. So this is for the threat actor who's in the local deception environment. This is the MITRE mapping for APT Group 3. And so the idea here is that you've got a pictorial representation that enables you to do two things. Firstly, the pictorial representation helps you to threat hunt. Now, I know that that's hugely challenging because of resource issues and costs and time. But if you can get a MITRE mapping, which is very clear and concise, it enables you to launch your hunting based on this MITRE mapping. And secondly, you can do a compare and contrast. You're contrasting the threat actor in your deception environment. Is it likely to be APT group 3? Or it could be a number of different APT groups that produce a similar mapping, but it contextualizes the threat immediately, so you're not operating without context. And context is important because it empowers you to make the right decision at the right time. Here, the wording on the slide is reference scenarios, but this simply highlights the point that I made earlier on. Deception technology is incredibly, the architecture upon which it's built is very, very flexible. And please don't think of it as a single use case only to detect attackers once they're inside your network. Yes, we can do that. You can see that on the left-hand side of the screen. So we cover, lateral movement detection of the Active Directory to the Active Directory, breaches of the network. But we also cover ATMs, SWIFT, vulnerable Wi-Fi access points. Okay, so if we were to stand up a deceptive asset that looked like a Wi-Fi access point, who would attack it? What are the TTPs that are being used against it? And the Wi-Fi access points that we have, are the controls that we have in place effective against the actual TTPs being deployed against the deception asset? Because that's not based on theory, it's based on actual TTPs being used against your infrastructure. And then we've got a multi-scope scenario. So these are scenarios where we can take also into account things like VIP protection. The word used there is counter phishing, but here is to understand who's spear phishing you, why are they spear phishing you, which of your leadership team are they specifically looking to target and why. And then you've got the purely external campaigns that I mentioned earlier. Now, I don't again tend to spend a huge amount of time on this. These are some of the benefits, and I've already touched upon this, the benefits that deception technology can bring to your security operations. I want to get to this slide. This slide is really, really critical, I think, in terms of what value deception brings. If you look at the bottom of the pyramid, now that currently, I'm not saying this may be the case for everybody, but the majority of people may be deploying their security budgets focusing in on perhaps the bottom components of that pyramid. The problem being is that those are fairly simple for the attackers to change in order to evade the controls that you have in place. Hence, trivial, easy, simple and annoying. Now remember, right at the beginning, I said, what's the goal of deception technology? To identify TTPs and tools that the attackers are using. Why does that give you a huge advantage when it comes to security operations? Because those top two components of the pyramid of pain are the most difficult for threat actors to change. And hence, when looking strategically at how you deploy security assets to detect, deflect attackers, you need to ask yourself, what do we have deployed that currently focuses on the top two components of the pyramid, because those are the ones that are likely to bring us the greatest return on investment. One of my favorite slides, I promise you I'm beginning to wrap up here. I often get this, but Naheem, please wait, I need to get the basics right. The problem with that is that the attackers will not be waiting. The question that you need to ask is, that's a residual risk. Can a security organization in 2020 go to its board and say that we need to get patching right before we move on to more sophisticated security tools? There's absolutely no reason why you cannot use deception to mitigate the residual risk that's left behind whilst you're still trying to get your patching sorted out. It may sound and look like as if it's an advanced tool. Absolutely not. It fits security organizations that are trying to build a coherent and long-term security strategy. You get it in alongside your patching process. It's security by design and by default. and is likely to be far more successful than rather trying to build it on top and bolting it on top once you've got all of these other varied and very complex security tool sets in that require very high levels of resourcing and are taking the big data approach. Kill chain, you're all very familiar with this now. Again, just to emphasize the pyramid of pain and why deception technology is really important. Currently, with the way that security assets are deployed, the focus is on those three components of the kill chain, right? The problem is at those particular 3 points, you've already got disruption to business as usual activity. And here's a thought I'd like to leave you with today. What about moving the kill chain to the left? So what about actually using deception, deploying deception externally to understand DTPs and tools and actually mapping the adversary before they get anywhere near your network? And what's the purpose of that? So we understand the TTPs and the tools, so then you can then check to see, do you have the right security real estate in place to meet those attacks? So the question is, do you want to move the kill chain to the left? Do you want right data as opposed to big data? Those are some key takeaways, but I'm sure that you've come across those on a fairly regular basis. It's good to talk. You can see my email address there, website, or you can reach out to ISOC24 and communicate with us through them. Mark, at that point, I'd like to hand back to you and ask, do you have any questions?
Sounds complicated. How complicated is it to use and deploy deception?
Deception is one of the points that I touched upon right at the sort of beginning, is that it is relatively straightforward and simple to use. Now, what I mean by that is that there's a huge amount of automation built in. We have templates so that we remove the thinking for you, and deception campaigns if we compare it to traditional technologies such as SIEM, and again, I'm not picking on these particular technologies, please don't think that, but if you look at NAT, a SIEM, those can take months or even years to roll out. A deception technology can be rolled out in a matter of days. So that shows you how simple it is.
Okay, and that goes for the SaaS-based solution as well as the on-prem solution.
That's a very good point that you make, Mark. We also have a SaaS-based solution, so we have a version of the product that runs entirely in the cloud, and Mark, that can be up and running within 48 hours.
Okay, thank you. Other question. It sounds expensive because of its advanced capability. Is this the case? What are the costs? Barely.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And the way that I'd answer that question is that certainly from our perspective here at Countergraph, our prices are comparable to the prices that you may be paying for your tip platforms. And as we don't charge per endpoint, we're very, very competitive when it comes to pricing. It's going to cost you far less than using some of those traditional technologies that I was talking about in my slide deck. So I hope that puts it into some kind of context.
Okay, thank you. The medium-sized company, am I ready for deception? What kind of a network environment do you need to have?
It's a very good question. Again, I do like the questions that are coming in today. So for medium-sized organizations, and I'm not saying that this is the case for all of them, but you may have a completely flat network, you may not have EDR. The point that I made to you was that during the course of the presentation was that deception is not going to, number one, it's simple to deploy, it's quick to deploy, and it does not require an army of analysts to fine-tune or to get right. It gives you a level of coverage immediately from day one. And what you can then do is, if you want to layer on top of that things like AV or EDR at a future date, you'll still continue to receive benefits from your deception technology in the long term, because remember, you can use it against a number of different threats. So we talked about we talked about Swift, ATM, web apps, or databases. So not only would it protect the endpoints, but also some of your application servers, AD infrastructure. And then if you move it externally as well, remember we're talking about moving the kill chain to the left, it can also preempt and collect information about people that are focusing in on you. So for a medium-sized organization, the return on investment makes absolute sense, because as you grow and as you become more mature with your security real estate, how you use deception simply evolves, and also it gives you added protection because you're getting defense in depth. So if they do get past the EDR, now we do have lots of case studies where we've seen red team exercises where the attackers have bypassed EDR but have been caught out by deception technology. So yes, sorry, long-winded answer, absolutely valid for a medium-sized organization.
Okay, thank you very much.